As we begin talking about complex numbers, it is important that we understand a few things before we get um, into deeper topics on complex numbers. For example, I is an imaginary number. It is imaginary because I equals the square root of -1. Now, taking the square root of a negative number is impossible. So that's why we call it imaginary. So now that we know that I equals the square root of -1, I squared, well, I know what I is. I just got to square what I is. I is the square root of -1. And I square the whole thing. And taking the square of a square root, all it does is eliminate the square root. That's why I squared equals -1. Okay? These two numbers are very important to remember. They're the only two that you really have to remember when dealing with imaginary numbers and complex numbers. Okay, so make sure you don't forget that I equals the square root of -1 and I squared equals -1. Okay, as we begin, and if you take a look at your textbook, one of the first examples is to simplify. Simplify the square root of -18. Now we see a negative underneath the square root. I'm dealing with imaginary numbers already. Okay. If you see if you see any number that's negative underneath the square root, you should already automatically think imaginary numbers and complex numbers. Okay. Now we have to simplify this. So the instructions say to simplify. Okay, and what we have to do here is break this up into its factors. Now, let's use 12 without a square root, just so you get reminded on factors. What factors are? Well, it's when we do this and find the two numbers that multiply to give you 12, and I'm going to list them off. Okay, these are the only factors, without repeating, the only factors of 12. I listed them out, and what I'm going to look for here is the pair that has a perfect square. Again, perfect square would be, right? If we list this off, this would be 1. 1 is a perfect square. 2 squared would be 4. 3 squared would be 9, and so forth. Okay, so these would be perfect squares. Okay, so take a look at those numbers just from the first 4, and I look here. I notice that this pair has a perfect square, so I will be using these two factors. I'm gonna do the same thing with these type of problems. When it says simplify and it has a square root, whether it has the negative underneath or not. Okay, so I'm gonna split this up. Now, it's gonna be slightly different because of the negative underneath the square root. I'll tell you why. Because I'm gonna have to multiply by 1/3. And this one in the front will always be the square root of -1. That is how I deal with or get rid of the negative underneath the square root. So when simplifying square roots with the negative, you'll always have the square root of -1 first, then you multiply by the factors. So let's list some factors. Okay, so I say, okay, well, I have 1 and 18. I have 2 and 9. I have 3 and 6. Okay, I can see that 9 is a perfect square. 1 and 18, well, 1 is a perfect square, but it wouldn't help much because the square root of -1 is 1. 1 times the square root of 18 is still 18. So I need to simplify this, which means kind of like a fraction. When you get a fraction 20 over 10, we can simplify to just 2. Okay, same here. So I take a look at these, and I would say I would include perfect squares that does not include 1. Okay, so I take a look at these and bingo, I see 9. So 2 times 9 will be the 2 factors or the pair of factors that I'm going to be using. Okay, so I'm going to erase some of this. Okay, so I'm going to use 2 and 9. So if I multiply all of these three, the square root of -1 times the square root of -2 is the square root of -2. Then the square root of -2 times the square root of 9 gives me the square root of -18. So all I'm doing is splitting this number up into its factors. Okay. Now, once I have like this and I've found my perfect square, I pulled out the square root of -1 from our definition of I. I is the square root of -1. So this is equal to 1. So I'm going to replace that with an I. Okay? Square root of 2 can't really do anything, so I'm going to keep it the same. Okay? Now I can take the square root of 9. Square root of 9 would be 3. Okay? Now, the proper way to write this, and I would be finished here. That's it. I'm done. Can't do anything else. But the proper way to write this, remember, this is multiplication. So multiplication properties state that, hey, I can have 1 times 12 or 12 times 1. I still get 12. I can have 2 times 6 or 6 times 2. I still get 12. So I can move them around. Any number like I and 3 that no longer have a square root are placed in front. So the proper way to write this would be 3i times the square root of 2. Now all of these are being multiplied. Now I wrote the 3 first because it's kind of weird to write x3, right? Or I3. Usually the letter is written second. So I'm going to write 3i square root of 2. So I can't go any further. That would be my simplified answer to the square root of -18.